I drove out to the old farm road late in the afternoon, the sun already low and hidden behind a thick wall of gray clouds that looked swollen with rain. The year was 2014, and I had taken a week off work to get away from everything. I was 34 back then, worn out from long shifts and city noise, and I thought staying alone at a farm cabin in southern Montana would help me restart my mind. The place belonged to a distant cousin who didn't use it anymore. He told me it was old but safe, and that the land around it was empty for miles. That part was true. When I reached the long dirt road that stretched across the open fields, I didn't see a single house, car, or even animal, just dry grass swaying in the cold wind. The cabin stood near the edge of a small patch of trees, far away from the main road. It looked like something from a different decade, built with rough wood, with a metal roof that had turned dull and rusty over time. As I parked next to it, I could already smell the dampness of the place, the mix of old wood, soil, and leaves soaked from last night's rain. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, feeling the floorboards sag slightly under my weight. The air carried that thick, stale smell that old cabins always have, like dust mixed with cold air and something else that had been sealed away for a long time. I dropped my bag on a narrow bed in the corner. The cabin wasn't big. It was one open room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, one table, and a few old shelves filled with random tools and containers left by whoever had lived here years before. There was no electricity, just a small battery lamp and a weak signal from my phone that faded in and out. The place had 2 windows, both cloudy and scratched, letting in only a dim gray light. Outside, the wind kept picking up, pushing the tall grass in long waves. I tried to settle down, telling myself this was exactly what I wanted: quiet, space, a place where I could hear my own breathing. But I felt uneasy the whole time, and I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the emptiness of the fields, or maybe it was the heavy silence pressing against the walls. When evening came, the wind grew harder. I could hear it rubbing against the sides of the cabin, making a soft but constant sound. I stepped out once to bring in more firewood, and I noticed deep tracks in the dirt near the side of the cabin. They looked like they had been made by a heavy vehicle, but I didn't see any tire patterns I recognized. They had been smoothed and blurred by rain and wind, but still clear enough to make me feel watched. I told myself a tractor or some farm truck must have passed through long ago. I lit a fire in the wood stove and warmed the place up. The wind howled across the roof, rattling the metal sheets. Every few minutes, I heard small thumps, maybe from branches hitting the walls. After an hour or two, I began to feel that tired heaviness creep in, the kind that only comes after a long day of travel. I stretched out on the bed, listening to the fire crackle, trying not to notice the sudden sharp creaks coming from the wooden boards beneath the cabin. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the stove. It was slow and heavy, like something dragging along the porch outside. I froze and stayed completely still. The cabin had no front porch light, so everything behind the thin walls was swallowed by darkness. I listened closely, trying to steady my breathing. The dragging sound came again, this time closer, as if whatever was moving had stopped and started again. The air inside the cabin felt different, more tense, as if the whole building was holding its breath. I reached for the small lamp next to the bed and turned it on. The weak yellow light barely filled the room, but it made me feel less blind. I looked toward the door, expecting shadows to appear at the bottom of it, but there was nothing. I sat up slowly, my feet touching the cold floor. I waited, listening, trying to understand the noise. Came again. Slow, steady, something moving across the dirt, too heavy to be a person walking lightly and too slow to be any animal I knew. The dragging continued for a long minute, then stopped completely. I stayed awake, sitting there with the lamp on, until my heartbeat slowed again. I told myself maybe it was a fallen branch sliding in the wind, or maybe an old piece of farm equipment out in the field shifting under the weather. But deep down, I knew it sounded nothing like that. I finally lay back down and tried to rest. I kept the lamp on. The wind returned to its dull, hollow moan, and for a moment, I thought whatever had been outside had moved on. Then, just before dawn, I heard something new. A short, sharp tap on the side of the cabin. Then another. Then a long scraping sound that seemed to slide across the lower wall. It reminded me of someone dragging metal across wood. My stomach tightened as I listened. I stayed in the bed, not willing to move an inch. The scraping continued for several seconds and then stopped. The silence after it felt even heavier. When daylight finally crawled across the sky, I stepped outside to check the walls. The ground was damp and cold. The wind had settled. I walked slowly along the side of the cabin where I thought I heard the scraping. The wooden planks were rough and weathered, but now they had fresh marks across them, thin, long scratches cutting through the outer layer of wood. They were too straight to be made by the wind, too controlled, and spaced just far enough apart to make my skin cold. They looked like something had dragged a tool or piece of metal along the wall, but I had no idea who would come out here or why. As I followed the scratches down the wall, I stopped when I noticed the dirt beneath the window. The ground was disturbed, pressed down in large, uneven patches, almost like someone had been standing there for a long time. I felt a chill run up my back. The tracks were wide but not shaped like footprints, more like heavy shapes pressed into the soil with no clear pattern. I walked around the whole cabin, checking everything. The marks stopped at the back wall, as if whoever had been there only cared about one side of the place. The field stretched out behind me in every direction, nothing but pale grass and empty land. I didn't feel safe anymore. I felt watched again, like something from the night still lingered in the daylight. Inside, I packed my bag faster than I expected. I kept checking the windows as I moved around the room. The scratches on the wall stayed in my mind, the dragging sound replaying in my ears. The silence felt wrong now. It wasn't calming anymore. It felt like something was waiting for me to stay one more night. I locked the cabin door behind me even though I knew the old lock wouldn't stop anything. I walked to my truck, my boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. As I opened the door, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The scratches on the wall were visible even from a distance, sharp as if they were carved with intent. I started the engine and pulled away. As I drove back down the long dirt road, I kept checking the side mirrors. The fields were empty, completely still, but I felt the pressure of something lingering behind me, something silent and patient. By the time I reached the highway, the tension in my chest finally loosened, but the memory of that night never left. Even now, whenever I think about that small cabin on the Montana farm, I picture the scratches on the wall and the heavy dragging sound outside in the darkness. I know it wasn't wind, and it wasn't any animal I've ever known. It was something real, something that came close enough to touch the walls beside me while I slept. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. The place is probably still standing out there in the open fields, lonely and silent, with those scratches carved into its side. Whatever made them might still be out there too, waiting for the next person who thinks staying alone in a farm cabin is a peaceful idea. And now I understand clearly that not all frightening things hide in stories or in the supernatural. Some things are real, solid, and close enough to touch, even when you have no idea what they are. And once you hear them move in the dark, you don't ever forget. I was 34 when I decided to spend a week alone in a hunting cabin deep in the forests of northern Alberta. The year was 2019, and I had been working nonstop for months, skipping days off, ignoring sleep, letting stress pile up until everything felt tight in my chest. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. I wanted a place where I could sit in cold air and hear nothing but trees moving. The cabin belonged to a friend who used it mostly during elk season, and he told me it stayed empty the rest of the year. I took the offer without thinking twice. The road to it was old and full of potholes. I drove a dusty pickup, and every bump made something inside the truck rattle. The woods were thick on both sides, so dense that even sunlight looked weak when it pushed through. I kept checking my side mirrors because I felt like the forest kept closing in behind me. Once the cabin finally came into view, it looked smaller than I expected. It sat on a patch of frozen ground near a dried-up creek, made from older wood that was dark and weathered. There was a metal chimney pipe sticking out of the slanted roof, and the windows were covered with dust as if no one had touched them for years. I stepped out into the cold and smelled pine and dirt. The air felt clean, but there was the strange stillness that made my skin feel tight. I unlocked the cabin and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale like old clothes and dry wood. The place was simple: one room, a small bed against the far wall, a table, 2 chairs, and a shelf full of cans and matches. There was a wood stove in the corner with a small pile of chopped logs beside it. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Even outside the window, I could see the woods standing completely still. I spent the first couple of hours cleaning dust off everything. I swept the floor, shook out blankets, and wiped the countertops. When I got the fire going, the cabin felt warmer, almost peaceful. For a while, I believed the silence was what I needed. I sat at the table with a can of soup heating on the stove and watched the shadows dance a little on the walls. But as the evening got darker, something felt different. The silence didn't feel peaceful anymore, felt heavy. I started noticing every sound: tiny cracks from the wood, small taps outside, the wind changing directions. I tried to brush it off as normal forest noise. It usually is. I knew that, but some part of me kept expecting something else, something wrong, even though I couldn't explain why. That night, after I crawled into the bed, I lay there listening to the fire slow down. When the last bit of heat faded, the cabin cooled fast. I wrapped myself tightly in the blankets, staring at the ceiling. Couldn't sleep. My mind wouldn't shut down. Something about the stillness outside made me feel watched, even though there were no windows facing the bed directly. I kept imagining footsteps in the snow even though the ground was mostly frozen dirt. At some point, I finally drifted off, but the sleep was shallow and full of strange half-dreams where I saw shapes moving between trees. The next morning felt normal again, at least for a little while. I stepped outside with my thermos and looked over the forest. The air was sharp and cold enough to sting my nose. I walked along the dried creek bed to stretch my legs. The earth was cracked, covered in frost, and the trees formed a tight wall on both sides. I saw tracks here and there, deer, maybe a wolf, but everything looked old, like nothing had passed through in days. As I walked farther, I noticed something strange. About 100 meters from the cabin, the trees were marked. Not scratched by animals, these were straight lines cut into the bark. Long, shallow, almost uniform cuts running down the trunks. Not random, not natural. Someone had made them, and they weren't old either. Some sap still glistened around the edges. My stomach dropped. I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe hunters marked a path. Maybe my friend did it years ago. But the marks looked too fresh and too precise for that. I didn't stay long. I walked back to the cabin faster than before, and even though nothing moved behind me, I felt the same tightness in my back, like a set of eyes were fixed on me. Inside the cabin, I tried keeping myself busy. I made coffee, chopped more wood, cleaned my rifle even though I didn't plan on hunting. But the feeling stayed with me, thick and impossible to shake. By afternoon, the sky turned gray and the wind got stronger. The trees outside started to sway, and the sound of branches creaking echoed across the clearing. Around sunset, I stepped outside to grab more logs from the small shed behind the cabin. The shed door was slightly open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I had closed it earlier. When I walked closer, I noticed the latch was bent, like someone had tried forcing it open, but nothing inside was disturbed. The tools were exactly where they were supposed to be. The woodpile was untouched. It didn't make sense, and the unease crawled deeper. By the time night came, the forest felt alive with noise. The wind pushed against the cabin over and over, making the walls groan. I kept checking the windows even though they were too dusty to see out of clearly. Couldn't relax. My hands felt cold even near the fire. At some point late that night, long after I had blown out the lantern, I heard something outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't branches. It was slower, heavier, like soft, deliberate steps moving across the clearing toward the cabin. The kind of steps someone makes when they're trying not to be heard. I stayed completely still in the darkness, barely breathing. The steps approached the window closest to the bed, stopped for a moment, then moved again toward the back wall. I felt every hair on my body rise. I could almost picture someone standing right outside, inches from where I lay, listening through the thin wooden wall. The cabin offered no protection. Anyone with enough force could break a window or shoulder through the door. I waited, frozen, until the steps faded again. The rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the sound in my head, trying to convince myself it was an animal. But animals don't move like that. They don't pause in specific spots. They don't circle structures slow enough to feel like they're studying them. When morning finally came, I stepped outside with my heart still racing. The ground around the cabin showed faint impressions, not clear enough to see shape, but clear enough to know someone had been there. Human or animal, I couldn't tell, but something had walked close, very close. I didn't waste time. I packed everything into the truck faster than I ever have. Before leaving, I checked the tree line one more time. The forest stood still again, almost pretending nothing had happened. No footsteps, no sounds, just cold air and tall trees. But the marks on the trees were still there, and the bent latch, and the prints around the cabin. As I drove away, every few seconds I checked my mirrors. The road behind me stayed empty, but that feeling didn't leave. It stayed with me all the way back to town and for weeks after that. The truth is simple. Someone was out there in those woods with me. I don't know who. I don't know what they wanted. Maybe it was a hunter trespassing on land that wasn't his. Maybe it was someone living off the grid who didn't want strangers around. Maybe it was just someone who noticed the cabin lights at night and got curious. But nothing about the way they moved felt normal. Nothing about the careful circles they made around the cabin felt harmless. And the way they walked, slow, quiet, patient, made it very clear that whoever it was had no intention of being seen. I never went back to that cabin again. And even now, years later, whenever I think about those marked trees and those steps outside the thin wooden walls, I'm still certain of one thing. If I had stepped outside that night, even for a second, I would not have made it back. It was late October of 2012 when I decided to take a break from everything and go on a solo trip to the Scottish Highlands. I had been working in London for almost 5 years, buried in spreadsheets and deadlines, and the thought of escaping into the quiet of the countryside felt like the only way to breathe. I booked a small cabin through a local agency, somewhere remote in the Cairngorms National Park. The listing was sparse. A wooden cabin, a small fireplace, a few beds, and a well for water. Sounded perfect. I arrived on a cold, drizzling evening. The air smelled of wet pine and damp earth. The gravel path leading to the cabin was narrow and lined with trees whose branches swayed in the wind, scraping against each other with a hollow, almost complaining sound. My car's headlights barely lit the road, and every few meters, the darkness seemed to swallow the light entirely. When I finally saw the cabin, I was relieved. It was small, made of dark timber, with smoke curling lazily from the chimney. The windows were dusty, and the door looked like it had been patched up in places with mismatched wood. The isolation was striking. No neighbors, no streetlights, no sound except the wind and the occasional rustle in the trees. I parked the car and grabbed my bags. My dog, Max, a black Labrador with a thick coat, jumped down and immediately began sniffing the ground and trees. He was a calm dog, usually unbothered by strange environments, but that night he was tense, ears flicking, body low. I brushed it off as him sensing the wilderness. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A small wooden table and chairs sat awkwardly in the center, and the kitchen was tiny but functional. There were 2 bedrooms, a small bathroom, and an old rug in the living area that smelled faintly of mildew. I unpacked, lit the fireplace, and settled in with Max at my feet. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, and for the first time that night, I felt a prickle of unease. It was close to midnight when I first noticed her. I had gone outside to check the back of the cabin, where a small trail led into the woods. I had a flashlight, and Max was on a leash, sniffing eagerly. That's when I saw movement at the edge of the trees, maybe 50 meters away. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the way she stood, rigid and still, made me pause. She was tall, thin, wearing what looked like an old, dark coat. Her hair was long, stringy, and black, and her face, though partially hidden, looked pale in the dim light. There was something off, unnatural about her posture, like she wasn't entirely relaxed in her own body. I froze, holding Max close. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. Then, almost imperceptibly, she raised her arm, and it felt like she was pointing directly at me. My heart thumped so hard I thought she must be able to hear it. I blinked, and she was gone. Just like that, I convinced myself it was a trick of the shadows, that the darkness had played on my mind. I went back inside, locked the doors, and tried to sleep, but Max wouldn't settle. He growled at the window repeatedly, his hackles raised, and I kept glancing outside, half expecting to see her again. The next day, I tried to distract myself with a walk through the woods. The trails were muddy from the rain, and the air was thick with mist. As I wandered, I kept thinking about the woman, but the forest seemed empty. I saw no footprints other than my own and Max's. Still, there was a feeling of being watched. I kept turning around, scanning the trees, and every time I thought I saw movement, it vanished before I could focus. That evening, I decided to explore around the cabin again, carrying a stronger flashlight this time. Max stayed close, occasionally barking at shadows. That's when I noticed something strange by the well. Footprints, barefoot prints leading away from the cabin into the trees. They were small, delicate, and fresh, pressed into the wet soil. My stomach tightened. I didn't hear anything, but the prints seemed deliberate, almost like she had been circling the cabin. I went inside, double-checked the locks, and tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had wandered in earlier, someone staying nearby. Maybe the cabin had other visitors. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The nearest road was over a mile away. The forest was thick. No one would stumble upon this place by accident at night. By the third night, I was on edge. The wind had picked up, and rain lashed against the cabin, making the walls shiver. Max refused to sleep, pacing constantly. That night, I heard it, soft footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, almost gliding. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight. The sound stopped. I turned toward the window, and there she was, standing just beyond the glass, staring in. Her eyes were hollow, black, unblinking, and her mouth was slightly open, as if she were breathing silently. I grabbed Max and ran to the front door. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just kept watching. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. After a moment that felt like hours, she turned and disappeared into the rain-soaked night. I bolted inside, barricaded the door with a chair, and sat trembling until dawn. The next morning, I called the local police. I explained what had happened, expecting them to think I was crazy, but they were concerned. They said the area had been known for squatters in old, abandoned parts of the forest, people who survived off the land, hiding from society. They suggested I stay put until they could send someone by. I agreed, though the thought of waiting in that cabin with the memory of her staring through the window made me nauseous. Around noon, I heard a knock on the door. My heart stopped. I hesitated, then looked through the peephole. It wasn't her. A middle-aged man with a worn jacket and a cap was standing there. He introduced himself as a local forest ranger. I told him what happened, and he listened carefully. He said the woman I described had been seen in the area before, living rough, sometimes friendly, sometimes frightening, often disappearing into the woods for days. He offered to stay near the cabin with me for a while. Over the next 2 days, he and I monitored the area. At first, we saw nothing, but on the second night, she returned. This time, we were prepared. She stood at the edge of the trees, watching, but the ranger shone a flashlight toward her, and she retreated. We saw her move quickly, almost silently, melting back into the forest. The ranger explained that she likely had nowhere else to go, surviving off the forest and avoiding people. He said she didn't mean direct harm, but that her presence could be unnerving, even dangerous if someone panicked. I left the cabin the next morning. The experience left me shaken, but also strangely relieved. I realized that sometimes fear isn't about monsters or ghosts, but the unknown, another human being whose life had been pushed to the edges of normal society. She wasn't supernatural, she wasn't a spirit, she was just real, living in a way that terrified me because I couldn't comprehend it. Back in London, I told a few close friends what happened. Some didn't believe me, others didn't want to think about it. But I never forgot the way she moved, the hollow intensity of her eyes, and the sense that I had stepped into someone else's world entirely. Every time I hear the wind through trees, I remember that cabin, the isolation, and that brief, terrifying glimpse of a life so different from mine, yet undeniably real. Even years later, I can picture her standing there, rain dripping from her coat, silent, watching, and I understand now that fear sometimes comes from recognizing someone else's survival instinct, pure, raw, and utterly alien to the world we think we know. I remember that night like it was carved into my memory. A rainy October evening in 2012, deep in the forests of northern Vermont. I was 28 at the time, and I had convinced myself that a solo weekend in a remote cabin would be the perfect escape from the city, the stress of work, and the endless hum of noise that had begun to weigh on me. I brought Max, my German shepherd, along, knowing his presence would make the solitude bearable. The drive had been long and exhausting. The rain started early in the afternoon, drumming against the windshield in a constant rhythm, making the winding dirt road slick and treacherous. My old Subaru groaned and slid in patches of mud, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. Max pressed close beside me, ears perked, tail rigid, sensing something I couldn't. The cabin came into view just as dusk began to swallow the sky. It was small, made of dark, weathered wood with a steep roof and a thin plume of smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney. There was no electricity running to it. Only a small generator sat in the corner of the porch, silent and still. The isolation was complete, the forest pressing in on all sides, trees bent under the weight of the rain, their leaves glistening like dark jewels in the fading light. I parked and took a deep breath, trying to shake the tension in my shoulders. Max leaped out, shaking the rain from his coat, and trotted around the cabin, sniffing and circling, alert to every sound. I followed, dragging my duffel bag behind me, the leather soaked through, water pooling inside where the zipper didn't quite seal. The front door stuck slightly as I pushed it open, the hinges creaking like bones. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood, old smoke, and something faintly earthy, like wet soil. I dropped my bag and fumbled for the matches I had packed, lighting the small gas lantern on the table. The flickering light cast long shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to twitch and shift as the storm outside intensified. Rain slammed against the roof in torrents, and the wind made the trees groan and scrape against the windows. Max sat close to me, his body tense, ears swiveling toward every noise, tail stiff. I set about unpacking, lighting the small wood stove, and stacking kindling in the corner. The cabin was simple, just a main room with a kitchen area, a small table, a bed in the corner, and a door leading to a narrow bathroom. The walls were lined with old shelves, mostly bare, some cracked glass jars and rusted utensils left behind by the previous occupants. I moved slowly, trying to ignore the hollow creaks and the way the wind seemed to whisper through the gaps in the wooden planks. By the time I had the stove roaring, night had fallen completely. The rain showed no sign of letting up, hammering against the roof in relentless sheets. Max curled at my feet, eyes half closed, but alert. I sat down at the table, sipping lukewarm coffee I had brought along, listening to the storm, feeling that strange, heavy sense of isolation settle over me. It started subtly, a sound at first so faint I almost missed it, the tap of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, not the light patter of rain, but something dragging slightly with each step. I froze, straining to hear, my heartbeat thrumming in my ears. Max lifted his head, ears forward, growling low in his throat. I told myself it was the wind, a branch knocked loose, maybe a deer or another animal, but the sound continued. Footsteps moving along the perimeter of the cabin, brushing against the wall on the far side. I reached for the small flashlight I had packed, my hands shaking, and crept to the window, peering out. Nothing, just rain, black shadows of trees, and the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the forest in stark, silver light. The steps grew closer. I could hear the subtle crunch of wet leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. Max stood now, hackles raised, growling louder, a deep warning sound. My chest tightened. The door was the only way in. I had locked it, but I knew that wouldn't stop someone determined enough. My mind raced. Who would be out here in this storm in the middle of nowhere? I tried to calm myself, to remind myself of logic and reason, but the tension coiled tighter and tighter. And then I heard it, a sharp, deliberate knock at the door. Not gentle, but heavy, like someone trying to make their presence known. Max barked, loud and urgent, but I held him back, fearing that noise might provoke whoever it was. I edged toward the door, trying to peer through the small glass window inset at eye level. Nothing. Rain poured down in blinding sheets, and yet I could feel, somehow, the weight of someone standing just outside. I grabbed the old baseball bat I had stashed by the stove, a weak sense of security in my hands, and backed toward the far corner, eyes fixed on the door. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe just minutes, I couldn't tell. The rain's roar and the pounding in my chest seemed to merge into one. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence, broken only by the wind. Max sat by my side, trembling, but alert. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every snap, every groan of the cabin, every rustle in the trees set my nerves on edge. When morning finally came, pale and gray, the rain had eased to a drizzle. I stepped outside cautiously, Max at my heel. Mud covered the ground, and the forest smelled fresh, damp, and alive. And there, in the soft, muddy earth around the cabin, were footprints. Heavy boots tracked along the side of the cabin, looping around, disappearing back into the trees. Not human, well, human in shape, but the prints were irregular, as if the person had struggled to keep balance, slipping and sliding in the mud. I reported the incident to the local sheriff, who came out later that day. He examined the tracks and the cabin carefully. His advice was simple. People sometimes hike or camp in these forests without letting anyone know, and during storms, they look for shelter or sometimes wander aimlessly. He didn't dismiss the fear, but his explanation made sense. Nothing supernatural, nothing that couldn't be explained. Just a person, alone, maybe lost, maybe desperate, leaving those footprints as evidence of their presence. I left the cabin the next day, Max and I driving back through the mud-soaked roads, the forest still dripping and heavy around us. I felt relief, a weight lifted. I also felt respect, a new understanding of how isolation could warp perception, how fear could take something as simple as footsteps in the mud and make it into a night of terror. Years later, I think back on that night, not with shame, but with clarity. I know now that fear is powerful, that it makes the ordinary terrifying. That night, Max and I survived not because of luck, but because of awareness, preparedness, and a stubborn refusal to let panic take over. The storm, the footsteps, the pounding rain. All of it is imprinted in my memory, but I also carry the lesson. In the wilderness, you respect what you can't see, you stay alert, and you trust your instincts. The forest didn't have to be haunted. It just had to be wild. That night changed how I see isolation, how I respect nature, and how I value the quiet vigilance of a loyal companion. Max never let his guard down once, and neither did I, and that awareness, that readiness, is what carried us through the storm and the night. By the time we drove away, the sun broke through the clouds, casting light on the wet trees, the mud, and the cabin now quiet and empty. A place that had terrified me hours before now seemed peaceful, almost ordinary. But I knew the fear I had felt was real, grounded, and most importantly, survived. It was the fall of 1998 when I first ended up in that old cabin near Blackwater Hollow Cemetery, on the outskirts of a small, nearly forgotten town in upstate New York. I was 24, broke, and running away from everything I thought I wanted to leave behind. A messy breakup, a dead-end job, and the constant hum of the city that made my head ache. I had been driving along quiet back roads for hours, the sky turning a dark shade of purple as dusk crept in, when I saw it. A narrow, unpaved trail veering off into the woods, marked by an almost invisible sign, the paint worn so thin it was hard to read. The road led to a clearing where the cabin stood, small and ramshackle, half hidden behind overgrown bushes and trees that had long since claimed the space around it. The cabin was made of dark, splintering wood, its roof sagging in the middle like it had given up trying to stay straight. The windows were grimy, some cracked, but the door looked functional enough. I don't know why I stopped there, but something in me demanded shelter for the night. There was no cell phone signal, no cars, no distant lights, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a crow. The air smelled like wet earth and rot, and I noticed, almost too late, that a low iron gate leaned against the edge of the clearing. Beyond it, in the shadow of gnarled trees, were rows of gravestones, their inscriptions weathered and in some cases barely legible. I left my car by the trail and walked to the cabin, each step crunching over dead leaves and twigs. The wooden porch groaned under my weight as I pushed the door open. Inside, dust hung in the air like smoke, motes visible in the last streaks of daylight. The cabin smelled of mildew, old wood, and something metallic, almost like rusted blood. It was bare, just a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a bed frame with a torn mattress. I dropped my backpack and lit a lantern I found on the table, the flame flickering against the walls and casting long shadows that made the room feel alive. I spent the first hour exploring. There were no modern amenities. No running water, no electricity, not even a hint of insulation. The walls were cracked, the floorboards uneven, and in the corner, a pile of broken furniture suggested someone had left in a hurry, or perhaps something had made them leave. I didn't stay long trying to make sense of it. Hunger drove me to rummage through my pack, and the quiet pressed on me in a way that felt almost physical. Outside, the cemetery seemed to grow taller as night fell. The gravestones, dark against the fading light, looked less like markers and more like silent sentinels watching my every move. As darkness fully descended, I lit a few candles I found on a shelf. The cabin glowed faintly, the walls taking on a honey-brown hue in the candlelight. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sharp tang of damp leaves. It was then I noticed the first sound that set my nerves on edge, the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path behind the cabin. My heart jumped. I froze, straining to hear. They stopped, just beyond the line of candlelight, silent for what felt like an eternity, then started again. Slow, deliberate, too heavy for an animal, too measured for the wind. I grabbed the old hunting knife I found in a drawer, though it did little to calm me. Every creak of the cabin floor seemed amplified, every groan of the wooden walls like a warning. I sat in the corner, trying to listen, but the night seemed endless. Minutes stretched into hours. I didn't dare look out the window. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever, or whoever, was out there was waiting for me to make a mistake. Morning didn't bring relief. The sky was a pale gray, clouds pressing low and heavy. I stepped outside carefully, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees, but there was nothing. The cemetery looked normal, quiet, though I noticed the soil of one particular grave seemed disturbed, as if recently dug. The marker had fallen to the side, hidden under leaves. I shook my head, telling myself it was just animals or weather. Yet something in the pit of my stomach refused to believe it. I decided I needed supplies. The cabin had nothing edible except some cans of beans and a rusty kettle. The nearest town was miles away, down the same road I had come in on. I drove carefully, the engine's hum a comfort against the silence that had been pressing on me for the last 24 hours. When I returned, I brought food and water, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night was worse. Around 2 a.m., the sound came again. Soft tapping against the cabin walls, like fingernails tracing the wood. It moved from one side to the other, slow, deliberate. My first instinct was to hide under the bed, but I knew that wouldn't help if someone tried to break in. I clutched the knife and waited, sweat running down my back. Eventually, the tapping stopped and silence returned. But sleep was impossible. I spent the night listening to the wind, the shifting branches, imagining every possible scenario that could end badly. By the third day, I decided I had to leave. Staying wasn't safe. The cabin's isolation was no longer comforting. It was a trap. I packed quickly, taking only what I could carry. Before leaving, I made one last loop around the cabin. That's when I saw it. Footprints in the soft mud near the back of the cabin, leading toward the cemetery. They were large, booted prints, too fresh to be old. I followed them cautiously, just far enough to see that they ended abruptly near one of the older graves, half covered in fallen leaves. Someone had been there recently, moving between the cabin and the cemetery in the night. My stomach turned, and I hurried back to the car. Driving away, I didn't look back. The clearing, the cabin, the cemetery, all of it faded behind the trees, swallowed by the forest. I couldn't explain what had been happening, and part of me didn't want to. But one thing was clear. That cabin had been a trap, a place that drew people in and held them with fear alone. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It felt like a rebirth, stepping back into normal life, leaving the oppressive darkness behind. Even years later, I remember that place vividly. The smell of mildew and earth, the groan of the floorboards, the crunch of footsteps in the night. I've told myself it was a hermit or perhaps some scavenger using the cabin as a hideout. There were no ghosts, no fairy tale monsters, just a place that tested my nerves, my patience, and my ability to stay calm under pressure. That day taught me something crucial. Fear is real, not because of stories or legends, but because of what humans are capable of when no one is watching. I never went back, and I never will. Some places are better left untouched, some mysteries better left unsolved. I never thought a quiet weekend in the mountains could turn into something I'd never forget. I was 29 at the time, exhausted from the constant stress of city life, and I needed a break. My dog, Tucker, a big, shaggy golden retriever, had been restless with me being gone all week, so I decided to rent a small cabin in the Rockies, far away from anyone else. The year was 2017, and I was ready to disconnect entirely. The cabin I found online looked perfect in the pictures. Secluded, rustic, with a small lake just a few hundred yards away. The owner mentioned it was a 15-minute drive from the nearest small town, but that the road got rough, so a 4x4 vehicle was recommended. I packed my old Jeep with food, water, blankets, and a few books. Tucker, of course, came along, whining excitedly in the back as I drove out of the city. The drive itself was uneventful, winding through tall pine forests and narrow gravel roads. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. It was smaller than I expected, just one room, a tiny kitchen, and a loft above. The smell of old wood and pine filled the air. I parked, grabbed Tucker's leash, and walked around the cabin, checking the windows and doors. Everything seemed in order, though the place clearly hadn't seen visitors for a while. Dust coated the floorboards and cobwebs hung in corners. I spent the first night enjoying the silence. No city sounds, no neighbors, just the occasional rustle of leaves and Tucker's soft breathing beside me. The next morning, I hiked down to the lake. The water was clear and cold, reflecting the sky like glass. I skipped stones, watched Tucker chase a few squirrels, and felt the tension I'd carried for months start to slip away. That afternoon, I gathered firewood from the surrounding woods, making sure to stock enough for the evening. It was the second night that things started to feel wrong. The wind had picked up, rattling the old cabin's windows, and the forest seemed alive in a way that wasn't comforting. Tucker was uneasy too, growling low in his throat at sounds I couldn't identify. I tried to brush it off: wildlife, the wind, my imagination. But there was a subtle, creeping unease that wouldn't leave. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Heavy, deliberate steps, crunching over the gravel and leaves. My heart sank immediately. I grabbed a flashlight and the small hunting knife I'd brought, careful not to make noise. The steps stopped suddenly, as if whoever or whatever was out there had noticed I was awake. I froze, listening. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate scratching on the door, like someone trying the handle without opening it. I whispered Tucker's name, and he whimpered, pressing against my leg. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it could be a raccoon or a bear pawing at the door, but the sound was too deliberate, too precise. I remembered the windows. They were old and thin. I moved quietly, checking each one, making sure they were locked. Everything seemed secure. The scratching stopped, replaced by silence, except for the wind. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept the knife on the table beside me and Tucker at my feet, alert to every creak and rustle outside. At first light, I opened the door cautiously. The ground was clear, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been near. I convinced myself it was a dream, the stress of isolation playing tricks on me. But later that day, as I went to gather more firewood, I found something. A small, crudely carved wooden figure, like a little stick man, placed at the edge of the clearing near the treeline. I froze. There was no way I'd missed it before. Whoever had been there had left it deliberately. My heart raced as I picked it up. There were scratch marks on its surface, rough and jagged, like it had been made in a hurry. Tucker growled low, staring into the trees. The rest of the day was tense. Every sound felt amplified. The cracking of branches, the rustle of leaves, distant animal cries. I tried to distract myself with chores around the cabin, chopping wood, cleaning up the small kitchen, even washing dishes, but the feeling of being watched never left. By evening, I decided I couldn't stay outside. I kept the door locked, stacked chairs against it for extra measure, and made sure Tucker and I were both close to the fireplace. Then, just after dark, I heard it again. Slow footsteps circling the cabin. This time, they weren't random. They were precise, methodical. Someone was walking deliberately around the back, then to the side, then stopping. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. My mind raced. Who could it be? The cabin was supposed to be empty, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Suddenly, a branch snapped right behind me. Tucker barked loudly, leaping at the door. I grabbed the flashlight and ran to the front, swinging the beam wildly. For a few seconds, all I saw was darkness, then movement, a shadow darting between the trees. I froze, heart hammering. It was impossible to see clearly, but I knew someone was there, watching. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my knife, flashlight ready, every sense on edge. By dawn, I knew I had to leave. I packed quickly, throwing blankets and supplies into the Jeep, Tucker jumping in with nervous energy. The drive down the mountain felt endless, every turn making me imagine shadows following us. When I reached the small town, I pulled into a gas station, shaking. The attendant noticed my state and asked if I was okay. I didn't even respond, just filled the tank and kept moving. Once I was back in the city, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They mentioned that the area had seen occasional trespassers, people who liked to stalk isolated cabins, but nothing serious had ever been reported. Still, they said to be cautious. Some of the trespassers were unpredictable and dangerous. I never returned to that cabin. Months later, I learned through a friend that someone had broken into the cabin a few weeks after I left. Nothing was stolen, but the interior had been disturbed, and more crude wooden figures were left around the property. It was clear that whoever had been there was not just passing through. They had been watching, learning, and waiting. The experience changed me. I realized that isolation, while peaceful, can also make you vulnerable. You think you're alone, safe, and in control, but one careless assumption can put you directly in danger. Tucker stayed close to me for weeks after that trip, never letting me out of his sight. I don't think I'll ever feel completely comfortable in a remote cabin again. The mountains are beautiful, the air fresh and pure, but I've learned that sometimes the real danger doesn't come from the wilderness itself. It comes from people and their patience to wait for the perfect moment. Even now, when I drive past a stretch of forest or see a cabin tucked into the trees, I can't help but think about that night. The quiet that seemed so inviting suddenly feels heavy, as if something unseen is just beyond the edge of your vision, waiting. I tell myself I'm imagining it, that it was an isolated incident, but deep down I know it was real. I know someone was there, and I know I got lucky. and I'm grateful for that luck every single day. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon, the kind of late where the sun already feels tired and the shadows look longer than they should. The cabin belonged to a coworker who told me it was the perfect place to rest for a few days, a break from the noise of the city. I had been working long hours for months, so being alone in the Northern Ontario woods sounded good. I didn't think I would regret it later. The place sat at the end of a dirt track that twisted between tall pines. The trees were so close together that they blocked most of the sky, and the forest felt heavier than any place I had been. The cabin itself was small, dark brown, and old. The wood on the outside walls had gray spots from years of rain. When I stepped out of my car, the air smelled like wet leaves and cold soil. There was no wind. The silence felt thick, almost like it pressed against my ears. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen on the left, a little living space on the right with a wood stove, and a short hallway leading to a bedroom and a bathroom. The boards under my feet creaked every time I took a step, and the air inside felt like it hadn't been moved in years. I opened the windows to let some fresh, cold air in, then unpacked my things and tried to relax. At first, everything felt normal. I made myself something simple to eat, walked around outside with a flashlight as the sun disappeared, and then returned inside as the temperature dropped. But the quiet of the woods at night felt different from the quiet of daytime. In the day, silence feels wide. At night, silence feels close, tight, almost like it has weight. I sat on the couch for a while, scrolling through my phone, trying not to think about how far I was from the nearest town. Later, when I finally went to bed, the floor creaked again. I told myself it was the wood expanding from the change in temperature. Old buildings always make noises. Still, it didn't feel like the normal kind of noise. It felt like footsteps. Slow, waiting footsteps. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening. The cabin settled. A branch touched the roof. The wind brushed the wall. Normal things I kept telling myself. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound I couldn't explain. It wasn't the floor. It wasn't the wind. It came from inside the wall near the foot of the bed. A small, dull thud. Then another. I held my breath and listened harder. Something scraped lightly, like fingers dragging across wood. I kept telling myself it was a mouse or raccoon. Something small, nothing dangerous. But the scraping was too slow, too steady, too heavy. I stayed awake until nearly dawn, staring toward that wall even though I couldn't see anything in the dark. When morning finally came, I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe I was just tired from the long drive. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and forced myself to ignore the nervous feeling in my stomach. I went outside and walked a long trail behind the cabin, hoping fresh air would clear my head. The woods were dense and silent. The ground felt soft under my shoes, covered in layers of dead pine needles. The deeper I walked, the more empty the forest felt. No birds, no animals, not even insects buzzing. Felt wrong. When I turned back, I kept glancing over my shoulder because it felt like someone was behind me even though I knew there couldn't be anyone that deep in the trees. Back at the cabin, nothing seemed out of place. The bed was messy from the rough night, the kitchen smelled like coffee, and the windows let in clean daylight. For a few hours I felt fine. I read a book, cooked, cleaned a bit, but the feeling never fully went away. The cabin didn't feel empty, it felt watched. The second night was worse. I tried going to bed early, thinking maybe the sounds would stop if I was asleep before they started. I was wrong. Around midnight, the scraping came again. This time closer, louder, longer. It moved from the wall behind the bed toward the wall by the door. The shift was slow, steady. I stared at the ceiling, too afraid to move. My chest felt tight. My mind raced through every possible logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Animals don't move slowly across different walls inside a building unless they already live there. And the way it moved didn't sound like an animal at all. After about an hour of this, the sound stopped. I stayed awake again until morning, feeling my nerves turn sharp and thin. When the sun came up, I checked every wall of the cabin, inside and outside. I tapped on them. I pressed my ear against them. On the wall near the bedroom door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. 5 small, thin marks in the wood. Straight lines, like scratches. Not deep, but too long to be from a mouse. Too clean to be from random damage. I didn't want to stay another night, but I also didn't want to admit to myself that something was wrong. I kept thinking I was being ridiculous. People go to cabins alone all the time. They hear strange sounds. It's natural. Old wood shifts. Animals scratch and climb. My brain was overreacting because I wasn't used to total isolation. But despite everything I told myself, the fear didn't leave. It only settled deeper. That night, the third night, everything became clear. The sounds didn't wait until midnight. They started just after I turned off the lights. Not scraping this time. Not soft tapping. Slow, heavy pressure pushing against the inside of the wall. Close, too close, right behind my head. The wall seemed to breathe. I froze. I didn't blink. My eyes burned from staring at the same spot in the darkness. The noise traveled upward, then stopped directly behind the headboard. Something shifted in the hollow space inside the wall. Wood cracked softly under weight. That was no animal. I sat up slowly and backed away from the bed. My whole body felt cold. The wall made another small cracking sound. I grabbed my bag without thinking, shoved everything into it in a rush, and left the bedroom. As I stepped into the hallway, a single loud thud hit the wall from the inside. A deep, heavy thud like a fist or a shoulder. I didn't look back. I left the cabin, locked the door even though it didn't matter, and got into my car. My hands shook so much that it took 2 tries to turn the key. When the engine finally started, I drove down that dirt track faster than I should have, looking at the cabin through the mirror until the trees hit it. 2 days later, when I finally told my coworker what happened, he paused for a long moment before telling me something he should have told me earlier. 3 years before, someone had gone missing in those woods. A man in his 40s. People searched for months but never found him. They assumed he left the area or got lost and died. But before his disappearance, a hiker had reported seeing a thin, quiet man watching cabins from a distance. Someone who looked dirty, starved, living rough in the woods. The cabin I stayed in was near the same area where people later found pieces of a makeshift shelter. Broken boards, old clothes, and food scraps hidden deep under brush. My coworker never thought much of it. Just another strange story in quiet woods. But after what I heard inside those walls, I knew the truth. The man never left the woods. He never died there either. He found a place to live where no one would look. And he was still there, waiting behind the walls of that old cabin, moving slowly in the hollow spaces, listening to anyone who slept inside. I never went back. I never asked what happened to the cabin afterward. The only clear ending to the whole experience is this: that man was real. He was alive. He was inside the walls while I slept only inches away. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I left, and that is the only reason I'm still here. I remember the summer of 1998 like it happened yesterday, though it was in the middle of nowhere in northern Montana, not far from the Canadian border. I was 23 then, fresh out of college, looking for something different, something that could feel like a real adventure, away from the cramped city life. I didn't expect the adventure to come with that kind of fear. I had driven my old, beaten-up pickup along gravel roads for hours. The sun was high, but the air was dry and heavy, carrying the faint smell of pine and earth. I had heard from a local at a gas station that there was an abandoned cabin somewhere near Willow Creek, deep in the woods. It was supposed to have been empty for decades, left behind after the owner passed away, and stories said it was falling apart. Perfect for me. I wanted to photograph it, explore it, maybe even sketch a few plans. I was alone, as I usually liked it, with my backpack, camera, and notepad. The road ended in a rutted clearing where the trees pressed in like walls. The truck rattled as I drove over hidden rocks, and when I finally stopped, the cabin was just there, half hidden behind overgrown bushes. It looked smaller than I expected, maybe 20 feet across, made of gray wood that had turned silver over time. The roof sagged in the middle and the chimney was broken. Windows had no glass, just jagged edges that let the sunlight in, making the inside look almost surreal. I stepped out, my boots crunching over dry pine needles and broken twigs. The smell hit me immediately: musty, damp wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. I didn't want to imagine what that was. I walked around the cabin slowly, circling it, noting the warped planks and the holes in the walls where animals must have made nests. A few boards creaked under my weight, and the thought crossed my mind that the whole place could collapse at any moment. I pushed it aside. Adventure demanded risk. The door was hanging on a single hinge, leaning outward slightly. I had to brace myself with both hands to push it open fully. Dust floated in the sunlight streaming through the broken windows, and it settled on everything like a thin, gray blanket. Inside, the floor was uneven, with boards missing here and there, exposing the ground beneath. There were remnants of furniture: an old wooden table, a chair tipped over in a corner, a cracked dresser, but nothing worth stealing. It was pure decay, pure abandonment. I walked carefully, feeling every step. The air inside smelled older than the world outside, like the cabin had swallowed decades of neglect. I noticed scratches on the walls near the corners, small gouges in the wood that looked like claws, or maybe just careless nails. I took photos, crouched low, trying to capture the light coming through the broken roof. Then I saw it: footprints. They were faint, pressed into the dust on the floor. Not human-sized, smaller, maybe someone who had crawled through the broken window recently. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably some animal, a raccoon or a stray dog. I didn't see any obvious animal tracks outside, but still, the prints were there, leading from the doorway to the back corner of the cabin. I didn't move closer at first. My body froze for a moment, my rational mind arguing with my fear. Curiosity won. I edged closer. The footprints ended near a hole in the floorboards. I peered into it and saw nothing but darkness. My flashlight didn't reach far, just illuminating layers of dirt and roots. Then I noticed the smell. Stronger now, coppery, almost sharp. It was not the smell of rust or decayed wood anymore. It was something else. I swallowed hard. My pulse raced. I realized this cabin was not just abandoned. It had been used by someone recently, someone who might still be around. I backed out slowly, but that's when I heard it. A faint sound like a floorboard shifting under weight, coming from the back of the cabin. I froze. My camera hung from my neck, and I gripped it, wishing for something to defend myself with. Then another sound, closer, heavier. Someone was inside. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, but a real presence. I bolted for the door. The hinge groaned so loudly it must have echoed in the woods. Outside, I ran blindly through the underbrush, branches whipping my face and arms. My heart felt like it was going to explode, every breath ragged. I didn't stop until I reached the truck, slammed the door, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I floored it down the gravel road, kicking up dust behind me. The woods seemed endless, the trees closing in like they were trying to trap me. But then I remembered the main road, the one that led back to the gas station. I held on to that thought and drove faster, careful not to hit any rocks or fallen logs. My hands shook so badly that I could barely steer. I didn't dare look back even once. By the time I reached the main highway, the sun had started its slow descent. The shadows were longer, the air cooler. I stopped at a small town a few miles down, parked near a convenience store, and just sat in the truck, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. I thought about going back with help, but my rational mind took over. There was no reason to risk returning. Whoever or whatever was in that cabin, it didn't belong to me. I called the local authorities the next day. They sent a ranger to check the cabin. When he came back, he told me the place had been used by a man living off the grid, a former logger who didn't want to be found. He had traps, makeshift bedding, and evidence of him hunting small animals for food. Nothing supernatural, nothing unreal, just a man who wanted isolation so badly that anyone who stumbled upon his home was considered a threat. I never went back. I still think about that cabin sometimes, about how close I came to walking straight into someone's hidden world. But I learned something that summer. Curiosity is fine, but respecting boundaries, even invisible ones, can keep you alive. I kept the photos and I still look at them, but now they remind me of how fragile safety can be, how quickly adventure can turn into fear. The woods remain the same, quiet, beautiful, and unforgiving. The cabin still stands somewhere near Willow Creek, falling apart, waiting. Not haunted by spirits, not a place of fairy tales, just a reminder that some places are abandoned for a reason, and some dangers are very real, very human, and very close. I survived, and that clarity, that fear and relief, is something I carry with me to this day. I was 28 when I took the job that pushed me into the most disturbing experience of my life. It was in northern Colorado, somewhere far from the usual highways people used. The year was 2017, early October, when the trees were bright yellow and the air felt sharp at night. I had been working odd repair jobs for months, moving from place to place because the money was better when you didn't stay in one town too long. A ranch owner offered me a week of paid work to fix an old hunting cabin on the far edge of his land. He said the place hadn't been used in years, and he wanted it cleaned up before winter storms came. I liked the idea of being alone in the woods for a while. I didn't think anything could go wrong. I drove up a long dirt road with deep tire grooves, and dust lifted behind my truck like smoke. The more I drove, the more quiet the world became. No houses, no other cars, only tall pines leaning together and blocking most of the sky. The cabin was about 2 hours from the nearest small town and 7 miles from the ranch house. It was built in the 1980s, but it looked older. The wood was faded gray, and the roof sagged just slightly in the middle. A broken porch light hung by one thin wire. When I stepped out of the truck, the first thing I noticed was how cold the air felt compared to the town I'd left earlier. It felt like a place that didn't want people in it. Inside, the cabin smelled like wet earth and dust that had been sitting untouched for years. The living room had a broken couch, a small wood stove, and a table with one leg that leaned. There were old boot prints dried into the dirt on the wooden floor, but the ranch owner had already told me he used to come out here with his brother. I didn't think much about them. For the first day, I worked on clearing out the old food jars, removing broken shelves, and testing the wiring. I kept the truck parked right outside because something in me didn't like the idea of walking far in the woods here. The trees felt too close, almost like they leaned in to watch me. I kept telling myself that was just my mind adjusting to silence. By the time evening came, the temperature dropped fast, and the wind picked up. I didn't want to run the generator all night, so I relied on a small battery lantern. I rolled out my sleeping bag in the living room, made sure the door was locked, and tried to sleep. But around midnight, I heard heavy steps outside, slow, dragging steps circling the cabin. Not fast, not animal-like, too heavy to be a deer, too steady to be random. I froze, listening, trying not to breathe too loudly. The cabin walls weren't thick, so every sound outside felt close. The steps stopped near the far wall. I waited for the sound to move, but nothing did. Then, after maybe half an hour, the steps started again, going in a slow half circle until they reached the front side of the cabin. Then they stopped again. I waited until almost dawn before I even dared look outside. When I stepped out, the ground was covered with fresh pine needles, and I saw deep marks in the dirt. Footprints, but not clear ones. They looked like someone had walked barefoot, but the prints were wide, too wide for normal feet. I told myself the shape was probably stretched by the mud or maybe just animals stepping in odd patterns. I didn't like the feeling in my chest, so I tried to ignore it. That day, I worked faster. I didn't wander. I kept checking behind the trees without meaning to. Around noon, I found something strange near the back of the cabin. A torn piece of dark fabric stuck to a low branch. It looked like part of a coat sleeve, maybe ripped recently. The edges weren't frayed from weather. It looked fresh, like someone had passed by only hours ago. By the third evening, when the sun fell behind the ridge, the forest grew darker in a way that made me feel watched again. I tried to convince myself it was just isolation getting to me. I ate canned food, cleaned my tools, and kept the lantern close. That night, the steps returned. This time, they didn't circle the cabin. They went straight to the door and stopped. I stared at the doorknob because I swore I heard the metal shift slightly, as if someone touched it gently. Not turning it, just touching it. I stayed awake all night. Every small creak in the wood felt like a warning. Every shift of wind against the walls felt wrong. By dawn, my nerves were shot, but I forced myself to stay to finish the job. I told myself the ranch owner's land sometimes attracted hikers or trespassers. Maybe someone was lost. Maybe someone was hiding. I didn't want to assume anything strange. Real people did worse things than any creature someone made up. On the fifth day, I saw the figure. I had been cutting old broken boards behind the cabin. The sun was low, only an hour from setting. I kept hearing something moving in the tree line, like someone pacing back and forth but trying to stay hidden. When I finally turned my head at the right second, I saw a man standing between two trees. He was tall and thin, wearing dirty clothes that looked torn at the shoulders. His hair was long, messy, and his head was tilted slightly like he was studying me. He didn't move. He didn't run. He just stared, and the way he held his body made me think he didn't know how to stand like a normal person. His arms hung too low, and his back curved slightly forward as if he'd been crawling for too long and only recently forced himself upright. What scared me most was not his face. It was that he looked like he had been trying to imitate a person, standing like one, watching like one, but not fully understanding how. I didn't make a sound. I slowly stepped backward toward the door. He didn't follow, but his head tilted a little more, almost curious. When I finally slipped inside the cabin, I locked the door and pushed the old table against it. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it echoed. For hours after dark, I heard scraping along the outside walls, slow dragging, sometimes fast, sometimes stopping. Once, something brushed the window. I didn't go near it. At around 3 in the morning, everything went silent, completely silent. Not even the wind moved. I waited until dawn before I dared open the door. He was gone, but there were long streaks of dirt across the ground where something or someone had crawled or dragged themselves away into the trees. I didn't pack. I didn't finish the job. I just grabbed what I could carry and left everything else. I drove down that long dirt road faster than I should have, gripping the wheel so tight my hands hurt. When I reached the ranch house, I explained only that someone had been living out there, someone dangerous. The owner told me he'd send his own men to check. I didn't stay to see what they found. 2 days later, he texted me, He said the cabin was empty. No footprints, no clothing scraps, no signs of anyone ever being there. But I know what I saw. I know how it felt to be watched by someone who didn't move like a normal human, someone who had been living alone in the woods, someone who tried to mimic human behavior but didn't get it right. I never went back to that part of Colorado again. I kept moving from job to job, but I always traveled with more gear, better locks, and a habit of checking the tree line every few minutes. The memory still sits in the back of my mind, not like a nightmare, but like a warning. The man I saw wasn't a creature. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't anything supernatural. He was a real person who had lived in the woods long enough to lose the idea of being human. A person who watched, learned, copied, and got parts of it wrong. A person who changed himself into something else. People like to use the word skinwalker for things they don't understand. I don't use that word. I just know that there are people out there who choose to become something different, something that doesn't fit into normal life anymore. And some of them stay close to the places where no one goes. Some of them watch, some of them follow, and some of them stand just far enough between the trees that you don't see them until it's too late. I saw one, and that was enough. I was 29 when I started my summer assignment as a park ranger in the dense wilderness of northern Montana, somewhere near Glacier National Park, but a bit off the beaten path. The year was 2014. I had taken the job thinking it would be peaceful, long hikes, crisp mountain air, and quiet nights under stars untouched by city lights. I was stationed in a small, isolated ranger cabin deep in the woods, a place that seemed far removed from the world, where the nearest road was a 20-minute drive over rough dirt trails, and cell service was intermittent at best. The cabin itself was built of dark, weathered logs with a sloping roof that had seen better days, and a small stone chimney that still worked, even though it smoked like crazy the first time I tried a fire. Inside, it was bare bones, a tiny kitchen area with a stove, a sink that mostly drained slowly, and a tiny wooden table with 2 chairs. There was a bunk bed shoved into the corner and a cast iron stove in the middle of the main room. The cabin had a single window that overlooked a small clearing, which faded into thick forest on all sides. I had been warned about bears and mountain lions in the area, and the local rangers told me to keep my food in bear-proof containers and to carry a rifle if I went on patrol. The first week was quiet. I spent my days hiking the trails, checking for fallen trees, counting wildlife sightings, and marking down notes in a thick logbook. Nights were the worst for me, though. The sounds of the forest at night are something you can never really get used to. The snapping of branches, the distant howl of wolves, and the constant rustling of something just beyond the tree line. My dog, a German Shepherd mix named Bruno, was my only company. He was a rescue, older and calm during the day, but at night he became a sentinel, growling at shadows and strange noises. It was a Tuesday evening when the first truly unsettling thing happened. I had spent the day hiking a trail along the ridge near the cabin and had returned just before sunset. I decided to have a fire going in the stove before nightfall. As I stoked the fire and made a cup of coffee, I noticed something strange outside the window. A figure, a man I thought at first, was moving near the edge of the clearing. He didn't seem to notice me, but he was walking slowly, almost deliberately, like he was watching something or someone. My first thought was that he was a hiker lost in the woods, maybe trying to get to the cabin, but something about his movements didn't feel right. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, Bruno immediately at my side, growling low in his throat. The clearing was empty. No man, no footprints, nothing. Just the slight imprint of what looked like tire tracks from a small ATV that had been long abandoned. I chalked it up to exhaustion, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dimming light, and went back inside. That night, sleep was difficult. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of someone, or something, treading softly on the cabin porch. Bruno growled fiercely, hair standing on end, but there was no sound of doors opening or closing. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it on the porch. Nothing. The wood was wet with dew, the steps empty. My heart pounded for hours after that. I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. The next morning, I went on a routine hike to inspect a fallen bridge on one of the smaller trails. The forest was thick and quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. As I neared the bridge, I noticed footprints in the mud. Human footprints, but larger than mine and deep-set, heavy. They led upstream toward a thicket of dense pines. I followed cautiously, rifle slung over my shoulder, Bruno alert beside me. The prints abruptly stopped in a small clearing, right at the edge of a stream. There were no signs of anyone hiding, no tent, nothing. Just prints that seemed to vanish into the earth itself. I went back to the cabin, uneasy but trying not to let it show. That night, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Bruno refused to sleep on his bed, instead pacing and growling at the window. Around midnight, I heard it again. The soft tread of boots on the porch, careful, deliberate. I didn't move at first, just listened. Then came the faint scrape, like a knife dragged across wood, followed by a pause. I grabbed my rifle and opened the door. Nothing. Over the next few days, it escalated. I started finding strange marks outside the cabin. Scratches on the logs, footprints that appeared and disappeared, and branches bent as if someone had been crawling under them. Bruno was constantly tense, ears forward, tail low. Once, I saw him staring into the woods, growling at a shadow that didn't move like an animal. My unease grew into something heavier, a constant knot in my chest. On the 5th night, it reached a breaking point. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from hiking in near 90-degree heat. Around 1 a.m., I woke to the sound of someone breathing outside. Heavy, deliberate breaths. I could see their shadow through the curtains, shifting across the window. My hands shook as I loaded my rifle. Bruno barked and lunged toward the window, but there was nothing there when I swung the door open. The forest was empty, the moonlight barely reaching the damp ground. I stayed awake the rest of the night, huddled with Bruno near the stove, the rifle across my lap. To first light, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I drove the old ranger truck into the nearest ranger station, nearly 20 miles away over the dirt roads, and reported the incidents. The senior ranger, a man named Holt, listened carefully. He didn't dismiss me but suggested that someone might be trespassing, possibly illegal hunters or campers avoiding detection. He promised to send a team in the following morning. When the rangers arrived, they combed the area. They found footprints leading into the forest, but nothing that suggested someone had camped or was hiding nearby. No tents, no discarded food, no signs of habitation. They did, however, find something strange. Crude traps set near the clearing. Nothing dangerous, just snares and bent branches, almost like warnings or markers. After that, the nights were quieter, but I didn't relax until the end of my summer assignment. I never saw the figure again, but I always felt eyes on me in the forest. Bruno seemed to settle down gradually, though he still refused to sleep near the windows at night. The rangers told me that the area had a history of people wandering in and watching the cabins, though no one had ever been caught or identified. Some used it to hunt illegally, some were just thrill seekers testing themselves in the wild. When I left, I packed my things slowly, making sure nothing was left behind, and Bruno and I drove back down the dirt road to civilization. I remember glancing back at the cabin one last time. The logs dark in the early morning light, the chimney cold, the forest quiet. It looked peaceful, almost like a painting, but I knew better. That quiet could hide someone or something watching, Years later, I still think about that summer. The forest, the strange tracks, the sounds at night. I've worked other ranger jobs since, but nothing felt quite as isolating or tense as that cabin. I never found out who or what was out there. I like to think it was just people, maybe lost hikers or trespassers, but a part of me knows the forest has a way of keeping its secrets, and some of those secrets are better left untouched. Bruno is long gone now, but I can still hear his growl in my memory, warning me, keeping watch when I couldn't. That summer taught me that the wilderness doesn't just test your survival skills. It tests your mind, your senses, and your patience. And sometimes, the things you fear most are the things you never see clearly. I didn't plan on coming back to that cabin, not after everything that happened years ago. Yet, there I was, driving down the narrow, pine-lined road in northern Maine in late October, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The air smelled of wet leaves and pine sap, heavy and sharp, and a thin mist clung to the ground like it didn't want to let me go. I'd left this place behind when I divorced Aaron, my ex-husband, but life had a way of circling back, and this time I was here for one reason: to sort through the cabin and the few things left behind, because the property was finally mine, free of any legal entanglements. I remember the drive clearly. The old GPS in my truck kept recalculating, but the directions were simple enough. Turn left at the old logging trail, it said. The road was more dirt than gravel now, covered with puddles from a recent rain, and every few minutes a low fog would drift in from the trees, thick and wet. My dog, Max, a German Shepherd mix I'd had for nearly 7 years, sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally letting out a soft whine when the truck hit a bump. He had always been sensitive to places like this, and I could feel him tense beside me. The cabin appeared through the fog suddenly, like it had been hiding just beyond the curve. Its wooden exterior had aged poorly, paint peeling, a few boards warped, and the roof sagging slightly in the middle, but it still had the same shape I remembered. The porch creaked under the weight of the years, and weeds had grown unchecked around the edges, some climbing halfway up the walls. I parked in the small clearing and stepped out, letting Max hop down beside me. The air smelled of damp wood and decaying leaves, but there was also a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. The front door was unlocked, as I had expected. The lock had never worked properly, and Aaron had always been too lazy to fix it. Pushing it open, I was greeted by the familiar smell of old pine, dust, and something else. Something sour, almost like spoiled milk, that made my stomach twist. The cabin was quiet, eerily so, but it didn't feel empty. I could almost hear the echoes of past arguments, the sound of Aaron's boots scuffing across the floorboards, his voice in a low, tense murmur. I shook my head, trying to push it aside. The past wasn't here. Only the cabin and its decay were. I walked through the living room first. The furniture was either gone or covered with white sheets that had yellowed over time. Dust coated every surface thickly, and the faint outline of where a rug had been was still visible on the wooden floor. Sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, catching particles of dust in the air like tiny, floating stars. Max padded behind me, sniffing everything, his ears pricked forward as though he sensed something I couldn't. The kitchen was worse. Cabinets hung crookedly, one door barely attached, and the sink was full of stagnant water that had collected over the years. The air was heavy, humid, and smelled of rust and decay. I remembered that Aaron had left this place in a rush years ago, and it showed. Opening drawers revealed old, yellowed papers, broken utensils, and a few cans of food that had long since expired. I pushed them aside and kept moving, trying not to think about how alone I was in this abandoned space. I made my way to the bedrooms, each step echoing across the creaking floorboards. The first bedroom was almost unrecognizable, furniture gone, the mattress reduced to a sagging, stained shell. In the corner, a broken chair leaned against the wall, its legs splintered. The second bedroom had been our bedroom once, and walking in was like stepping into a memory I didn't want. The bed frame was still there, empty and cold, and I could almost imagine Aaron sitting at the edge of it, his hands trembling with anger or fear. I couldn't remember which. My chest tightened, and I had to turn away. Max nudged my leg, grounding me in the present, and I followed him into the hallway. That's when I noticed the small noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint scraping like metal on wood, but it repeated, a slow, deliberate scratching coming from the basement door. My stomach clenched. The basement had always been Aaron's domain. He used it for storage, for projects, for the bottles of whiskey he kept hidden behind loose boards. He had spent hours down there alone, muttering to himself, and now, standing here years later, I felt the same creeping unease I had felt as a young woman, when his temper had been unpredictable. I hesitated. Max growled softly, low in his throat. I forced myself to move toward the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, and the smell grew stronger, sour, metallic, sharp. The basement door hung slightly open, and as I pushed it, the hinges groaned. My flashlight illuminated the bottom steps, revealing more dust and cobwebs than I thought possible. But the scratching stopped. Max barked once, sharply, and I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The basement was cluttered. Old furniture, broken boxes, rusted tools, and a few empty barrels filled the space. I moved slowly, scanning for anything that could explain the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. A thin trail of something dark on the concrete floor, leading from the corner near the old furnace toward the back wall. I crouched, my stomach turning. It wasn't blood, at least I didn't think so. It was too dark, too thick, almost like oil. My mind raced, thinking of all the ways this could have ended up here. Spilled paint, old chemicals, decomposition of some kind. I swallowed hard, following the trail with my eyes. Then I noticed the shape pressed against the back wall. A small, rusted metal box, partially hidden under a tarpaulin. The trail led straight to it. I reached for it slowly, hands trembling, expecting. What? I didn't know. I wasn't expecting anything. Lifting the tarp, I found the box, locked but old and brittle. I pried it open with a screwdriver I found nearby. Inside were stacks of papers, letters mostly, and a few photographs I barely recognized. One photograph caught my eye. A picture of Aaron, smiling, standing next to a younger version of me, holding Max when he was a puppy. My chest ached. I kept going through the papers, the sound of my own breathing loud in the silent basement. Most were mundane. Bills, old receipts, notes he had left for himself. But one envelope stood out, heavier than the rest. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in writing that seemed urgent, almost frantic. It was a confession, a record of debts, threats he'd received, mistakes he'd made. Nothing supernatural, nothing unexplainable. Just a man who had gotten in over his head and left the mess behind. My fear turned into a hollow, tense relief. This was why the cabin felt wrong. It wasn't haunted. It was a place heavy with history. A history of anger, mistakes, and secrets. I spent the next few hours sorting, cleaning, and cataloging. I wiped down the counters, stacked the papers, and even managed to sweep some of the dust off the floor. Max never left my side, his ears alert, his body close to mine. By the time I was done, the sun was low, and the fog outside had thickened. I stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cold evening air. The cabin was quiet now, neutral. No ghosts, no fairy tales, no supernatural whispers. Just wood, dirt, and the weight of years. I locked the front door for the first time in over a decade. As I walked back to my truck, Max trotting beside me, I felt a strange sense of closure. The cabin wasn't a place to fear anymore. It was a reminder of survival. I had walked through fear and memories, faced the echoes of a life I had once shared, and come out the other side. By the time I started the truck and the engine growled to life, I felt lighter. The road ahead was long, winding through trees and fog, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. I had faced the past, and now I was ready to move forward. I had been working in Manaus for a few months, mostly helping with environmental surveys along the tributaries of the Amazon River. The work was exhausting, but I loved the isolation, the way the forest seemed alive in every direction. That year, 2018, the rainy season had come late, and the forest was more oppressive than usual. Hot, wet, and buzzing with life in ways I didn't fully understand. I was 29 then, with more curiosity than caution, and it got me into trouble I'll never forget. The cabin I found wasn't on any map. It was a small wooden structure, half hidden in a grove of trees on the edge of a swampy area. The locals called it Casa do Rio, but no one I spoke to had been there in decades. The walls were made of rough planks, uneven and warped from years of humidity. A rusty tin roof sagged in the middle, and vines crept up the corners like fingers. I discovered it after a day of tracking wildlife along a narrow waterway. My boots were soaked, my shirt plastered to my back, and my backpack heavy with notebooks, camera gear, and some rations. I needed shelter before night fell. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me immediately. Damp wood, mold, and something faintly metallic. It wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't unbearable either. I dropped my bag in a corner and set about inspecting the place. The cabin had one small room and a loft above. A broken cot leaned against the wall, and a rusted stove sat in another corner. There was no electricity, no running water, only a small hand pump outside and a lantern with a cracked glass globe. I lit the lantern, the soft flicker casting long, uneven shadows across the floor, and I felt a sudden chill despite the heat outside. I spent the first few hours cleaning up a small area to sleep on. The floor was covered in dried leaves, insect husks, and something I couldn't quite identify. I swept it out as best I could, though the movement of the forest outside made every noise feel louder. Every branch that snapped under the weight of a bird, every rustle of leaves, sounded like someone or something was moving closer. I told myself it was just my imagination, the isolation messing with my head. But by the time the sun was setting, the sounds of the forest had grown sharper, stranger, and more deliberate. I ate some cold rice and beans I had in my bag while sitting on the cot. The walls creaked and shifted with the wind, though it barely moved outside. Mosquitoes had found their way inside despite my efforts, and I felt dozens of bites forming across my arms and neck. I tried to ignore it and focused on the noises outside. There was a tapping sound on the roof at first, soft and irregular. I assumed it was a tree branch, but when it kept going, steady now, I froze. My heart beat faster, my fingers gripping the edge of the cot. The noise moved from the roof to the side of the cabin, then stopped. Absolute silence fell, and I didn't breathe for several seconds, afraid that any small movement would announce my presence. Eventually, I told myself it was probably an animal, a monkey, a raccoon, maybe even a sloth with a broken branch. I went to check, taking the lantern with me. Outside, the air was thick with humidity and the smell of wet earth. The forest was alive with insects, birds, and the distant calls of howler monkeys, but nothing had moved near the cabin. I walked around, shining the light on the ground and the lower branches, but saw nothing. The tapping noise never returned. I spent the night in a half-sleep, every little sound waking me instantly. Rain started in the early hours, heavy and relentless, hammering the tin roof. The smell of wet wood became stronger, and the water from the roof dripped into a puddle that spread across the floor. My mosquito net wasn't perfect, and I woke several times with bites on my face and arms. Around 3 a.m., I woke to another sound, this time from inside the cabin. Scratching, soft but urgent, coming from under the cot. My dog, Max, was with me, my Labrador Mix, and he growled low in his throat, hair standing on end. I froze. The scratching stopped when I didn't move, then began again, closer now, moving toward the lantern. I grabbed a piece of firewood from the corner and slowly inched toward the source. Max stayed close, growling continuously. The scratching stopped again, and when I leaned the lantern just slightly, I saw it. An arm, thin and spindly, gripping the bottom of the cot. My first instinct was to scream, but I realized quickly it wasn't human. It was a raccoon or some other small mammal that had somehow gotten inside. Relief mixed with lingering fear. I closed the lantern carefully and shooed it outside. Max sniffed at the door until it was gone, then lay back down, still alert. The next morning, the forest seemed calm, almost peaceful after the storm. I decided to leave, but the path back to the river was gone. The rain had turned the ground to mud, hiding every footprint and trail I had used the day before. I tried to retrace my steps, but the dense trees, undergrowth, and high water levels made progress almost impossible. I realized then that I had underestimated the forest. I had survived storms, insects, and the occasional wild animal, but the forest itself was a challenge. It didn't care about me, and I had to navigate it carefully. I marked trees with cuts from my machete to track my route and moved slowly, checking every branch, every shadow. Hours passed, and exhaustion weighed on me. My water supply was low, and my stomach growled. Around mid-afternoon, I heard the sound of flowing water, faint but unmistakable. I pushed through dense vines and found a small tributary. I drank cautiously, then filled my bottle. Following the river downstream, I eventually reached a logging path I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a road exactly, just a series of flattened trees and mud tracks, but it led toward civilization. By late evening, I saw smoke rising above the trees. Another cabin, this one inhabited. I approached carefully, calling out softly, and was greeted by local workers who offered food, water, and directions back to Manaus. I told them about the cabin I had stayed in, the noises, and the raccoon incident. They shook their heads. Casa do Rio hasn't been used in 20 years, one of them said. You were lucky. Some people have stayed there and never been seen again. The forest claims careless travelers. I never went back to Casa do Rio. I don't know if anyone has since, but the experience stayed with me. The oppressive heat, the constant hum of insects, the sudden, terrifying noises in the middle of the night. Most of all, I remembered the realization that the forest isn't alive in a friendly way. It's alive because it survives, and survival doesn't mean mercy. When I returned to Manaus, I spent days scrubbing off mud, insect bites, and the lingering unease in my mind. Max slept next to me for hours, exhausted but alert, and I realized how alone we had been, how completely dependent we were on careful observation, patience, and luck. That trip taught me more about fear than I had ever experienced in a city or office. The forest doesn't forgive mistakes, it doesn't accommodate weaknesses, and it doesn't wait. But it also showed me that careful planning, attention to detail, and keeping calm under pressure could keep you alive. I left the Amazon later that year, changed in ways I couldn't fully explain. I still dream about that cabin, the rain, and the rustling sounds in the night. But when I wake, I feel a strange gratitude. I survived, and that, I realized, was the only ending that really mattered. I never thought a simple weekend trip could turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It was the fall of 2007, and I was 29, looking for some solitude away from the chaos of Chicago. I had recently ended a messy relationship and felt the urge to escape. The cabin I rented was tucked deep in the forests of northern Michigan, somewhere past the small towns, where the paved roads gave way to dirt paths and cell service was mostly non-existent. The drive had been long and tiring. I had rented an old Jeep for the trip, knowing I might need four-wheel drive on the last stretch of unpaved road. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun had already started to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in dull oranges and grays. The cabin itself was small, maybe 100 years old at best, but sturdy. It had a weathered wooden exterior, a tin roof streaked with rust, and a stone chimney that had clearly seen better days. I could see the faint smoke curling from it, which was comforting in a strange way. Someone had been here recently. I unpacked my bag, careful not to disturb too much dust inside. The interior was basic: a small kitchen area, a single bedroom, a living space with a wood stove, and a loft that could serve as extra sleeping space. The smell of old wood mixed with the faint scent of pine was strong, but not unpleasant. I felt a slight thrill being so far removed from the world, surrounded by nothing but trees, the faint rustle of wildlife, and the whisper of wind through branches. I spent the first evening chopping firewood, stacking it neatly next to the stove, and making a small dinner of canned soup warmed on the stove. Outside, the forest was growing darker, the noises more pronounced. The occasional snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves, and distant bird calls made me realize how alive the forest really was when humans were absent. I set a few candles around the cabin, though the dim light barely reached the corners. That night, I went to sleep early, the warmth of the wood stove keeping the room comfortable. Around 2 in the morning, I woke suddenly. The wind had picked up, shaking the cabin slightly, and there was a faint, irregular sound outside, like something brushing against the trees. At first, I tried to dismiss it as branches moving or a small animal, but the sound continued, irregular but deliberate. My dog, Max, a large golden retriever I had brought along for company, growled low in his sleep, ears perked. I lay in bed, listening. Then I heard it again, footsteps. Slow, careful, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. My heart raced. There was no road nearby, no trail anyone could have taken without me noticing, but the sounds were unmistakable. I grabbed the baseball bat I always brought on trips like this, its weight reassuring in my hands. I moved quietly to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered through the thin curtain. The darkness was nearly absolute, but I could make out faint shapes moving between the trees. The sound of crunching leaves and snapping branches confirmed it. Someone was outside. My first instinct was to call 911, but I realized I had zero signal. I was completely alone, aside from Max, and whoever was out there knew it. For the next hour, I stayed in the dark, listening. The footsteps moved in and out of my range of hearing. At one point, Max barked sharply, and the footsteps retreated for a few minutes. But then they came back, slower this time, deliberate, as if someone was circling, testing the cabin. I realized I had to do something more than hide. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whoever it was to make a move. I remembered the old shed behind the cabin. It was empty, but it had a large metal door I could bolt from the inside. I quietly unlatched the window and slipped outside with Max, staying low. The cold air cut through my jacket, and my breath came out in short puffs. I moved quickly to the shed, bolting the door behind me. Max was restless, sniffing at the door and growling. I sat on the floor, heart hammering, listening. The footsteps returned, circling the cabin again. Then I heard something else, a sound of metal scraping against wood. Whoever it was had found the door I had left unsecured. Panic rose in my chest. I considered running into the forest, but I knew that would be a mistake. The forest was dense, dark, and easy to get lost in at night. Whoever was out there had the advantage. I stayed in the shed until I heard nothing for what felt like hours. Eventually, I gathered the courage to peek outside. The forest was empty, eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I grabbed my bag, stuffed what I could into it, and prepared to leave at first light. I knew that whatever had been outside wasn't going to wait until morning. It was only a matter of time before it tried the doors, the windows, or worse. Morning came slowly, the sky gray and heavy with clouds. I waited until the light was enough to see the dirt path leading back to the main road. I packed my remaining gear, made sure Max was ready, and moved quickly but cautiously, scanning the treeline constantly. I didn't see anyone, but every shadow looked like a person. Every movement in the corner of my eye felt deliberate. By the time I reached the paved road, a mile down the dirt track, I felt like I could breathe again. My hands shook, my legs ached, but I was safe. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I finally got a signal. I called the local sheriff and reported what had happened. They took it seriously, mentioning that sometimes drifters or hunters moved through the area and occasionally spooked people in remote cabins. They didn't give me any real comfort, but it helped to know I wasn't imagining things. I never returned to that cabin. Months later, I learned from a local that it had been broken into several times in the past, and the previous renters had found evidence of someone living in the surrounding woods temporarily, hiding, watching, waiting. The thought chilled me. I realized how lucky I had been to escape without confrontation. Now, whenever I think about that weekend, I remember the sound of slow footsteps circling my cabin in the middle of the night, the scrape of metal against wood, and the suffocating isolation of being completely cut off from the world. But I also remember how I survived, staying calm, thinking strategically, and not underestimating the danger. It taught me something important about fear. It's not always supernatural. It's often very human, very real, and very close. And sometimes surviving is enough. It was late October in 2018, and I had decided to take a short trip alone to the mountains in northern Idaho. I was 28 at the time, and I brought my dog, Max, along. Max was a large, black Labrador mix, loyal and protective, the kind of dog that could sense danger long before you did. I didn't usually like being alone, but the idea of a quiet cabin tucked in the woods, away from everyone, sounded perfect. The stress of work had been unbearable, and I needed this trip to clear my head. The drive itself was long. The last 20 miles were on a gravel road that twisted through thick pines and towering firs. The sun was starting to set when I finally spotted the cabin. It was old, but sturdy. A single-story log cabin with a small porch and a woodpile stacked haphazardly on the side. Smoke curled from the chimney, and it smelled faintly of burning wood, which made me think the previous occupants had been careful with the fire or had left it recently. I parked my car and stepped out, Max immediately sniffing around, his tail stiff and ears perked. The wind was cold and sharp, rustling the dry leaves scattered across the forest floor. I carried my backpack and Max's leash up the short path to the cabin. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and the door was heavy but opened without resistance. Inside, the cabin was basic but functional. A small kitchen with an old stove, a few cabinets, and a table with 2 chairs. The living area had a sofa that sagged in the middle and a few shelves lined with dusty books. There were 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom. I set my things down and let Max sniff every corner. He circled the cabin 3 times before settling near the fireplace, his eyes alert, tracking shadows in the corners. I lit the fire using some of the old wood in the stack outside, and soon the cabin was warm, the flames crackling and casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The sun had completely disappeared behind the trees, leaving the forest outside in deep blue twilight. Max lay down beside me, his head resting on his paws, but I could tell he wasn't completely relaxed. Around 9:30 p.m., I decided to take a quick walk around the cabin, flashlight in hand. Max followed closely, his nails clicking against the wooden porch. The forest outside was thick, and the shadows from the trees stretched like fingers in the moonlight. I stayed close to the cabin, keeping an eye on Max, who suddenly stiffened and let out a low growl. At first, I thought he had seen a deer or a raccoon, but then I noticed it. A faint movement just beyond the tree line, a dark figure that seemed to watch us. My heart rate jumped and I called Max back to me. He hesitated for a moment but obeyed, and we returned to the cabin. I locked the door, checked the windows, and tried to tell myself it was just a stranger walking the woods or a hunter passing by. The night deepened. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks in the log walls. Max stayed alert, ears twitching at every sound. I tried to read, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The noises outside grew, twigs snapping, the rustle of leaves, the faint crunch of boots on the dirt road leading up to the cabin. Around 2 a.m., I woke to Max barking sharply. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the room. First, I saw nothing, but then the beam hit the window. Shadows shifted just outside. Someone was moving along the tree line, staying in the shadows but clearly circling the cabin. I stayed still, holding the flashlight like a weapon. Max growled, low and threatening, his body tense. I knew I had to act carefully. If whoever it was realized I was awake and aware, it could escalate. I reached for my phone to call 911, only to realize I had no signal. The nearest town was 25 miles away, and the cell tower coverage was spotty at best. My stomach twisted. I thought about hiding, but the cabin only had one main door and a couple of windows. Max would sense me leaving and panic. The footsteps outside continued. They moved slowly, deliberately. Whoever it was seemed to know the area, moving without making mistakes over the uneven forest floor. I checked the kitchen. There was a small hatchet in a drawer, a hunting cabin standard. I gripped it tightly, holding it close, knowing it might be my only protection. Max whimpered once but stayed close to me, his body rigid. Hours passed. Every sound outside made me jump. At one point, the figure disappeared entirely, only to reappear later, crouched behind a tree, watching. The wind was strong enough to blow out the fire, leaving the cabin in near darkness. I relit it and moved every piece of furniture I could to block the door. Max's eyes glowed in the firelight, alert and tense. By dawn, the figure was gone, and the forest returned to its usual quiet. I stayed awake until the sun rose, drinking coffee from the thermos I had brought and watching Max pace the cabin. He didn't relax until the first rays of sunlight hit the porch. After a few hours, I finally ventured outside. The gravel road showed signs of tire tracks, not mine, but there was no one around. Footprints led toward the edge of the forest, but they were too large and uneven for a typical hiker. I called the local ranger station on my way back to town and reported the incident. They said no one had reported missing equipment or suspicious activity recently, but they warned me the area sometimes attracted people looking for secluded cabins for reasons other than peace. When I returned to the cabin the next weekend, I stayed only a single night, reinforced the doors, and made sure Max stayed close. From that day on, I realized how vulnerable you could be in the wilderness, even with a sturdy cabin and a loyal dog. Max never let his guard down in that area, and I never went back alone. That experience stayed with me, a constant reminder of how unpredictable the world can be outside the safety of civilization. but it also showed me the quiet bravery of a dog who protected me without question. By the time we left the area, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the forest in gold and orange. Max and I walked back to the car slowly, both of us wary but relieved, knowing we had made it through the night together. The cabin still stands, abandoned now, I hear, but I don't intend to find out what or who haunts its edges anymore. The memory of that night is enough, a lesson in vigilance, trust, and the wild, raw reality of being alone in the woods with nothing but a loyal companion and your own senses to protect you.